Who could believe, looking at life in France in 1914, that the country, along with the whole of Europe, was about to be struck by one of the most terrible tragedies in history? It is true that Alsace-Lorraine was still an unhealed wound, and that there was bitter hatred of the Germans, still known by the insulting name of Les Boches. But nobody really thought that war was possible. There had been peace for nearly 45 years. It was the time of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the Entente Cordiale had replaced the old rivalry with Britain. But the danger was there. Europe's peace was an armed one. The Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a place in the sun. The Parisian crowd filled the Avenue du Bois. Paris danced in the beautiful summer of 1914. And then a spark set everything aflame.
'15 was the first full year of the First World War. The war of movement that had been a feature of the first weeks of the war had become bogged down in the stalemate of trench warfare. In Western Europe, the Germans had settled into well-prepared positions, often taking the valuable high ground. It meant that the French and their British allies would have to attack these defences if the Germans were to be defeated. '15 was to be a year of frustration for the Allies, as they tried in vain to force a breakthrough. There was also a widening of the conflict with the ill-fated attempt at a landing in Turkey in the Dardanelles, and the entry of Italy into the war on the side of the Allies. 1915 was also to see warfare take on a new dimension, with the bombing of British cities by Zeppelin airships, and the beginning of attacks of Allied and neutral shipping by German U-boats, a policy that would eventually bring the United States into the war. The year began with fighting in the Champagne and Artois sectors of the Western Front. Despite repeated attempts to dislodge them, the German defences were far superior, with well-prepared machine gun positions, taking a heavy toll on French attackers. Fighting continued without break until mid-February. There was a brief lull to reorganise before battle was resumed. But by mid-March, the entire offensive had been called off by the French, owing to the strength of German counterattacks and a costly lack of success. Champagne was to be the scene of another major offensive later in the year. Meanwhile, the war was about to take on a new deadly turn, in that it brought civilians hundreds of miles away into the sphere of combat. On the night of January the 19th, the German Navy launched the first with Zeppelin airships to attack the British mainland. This was the first of many raids, which continued at a rate of around 2 per month, in parallel with continuing reconnaissance patrols. The German Admiralty was very enthusiastic about the results and asked for permission to bomb London. This was only granted by the Kaiser after a series of raids by French bombers on German cities. On the 31st of May 1915, the first raid was carried out against London, killing 7 and injuring 35. The most successful Zeppelin raid on London in the entire war was on the 8th of September 1915. This raid caused more than £500,000 of damage, almost all of it from the one Zeppelin, the L-13, which managed to bomb central London. This single raid caused more than half the material damage caused by all the raids against Britain in 1915. Throughout the remainder of 1915, the Zeppelins raided London frequently and with impunity. They flew too high for most planes, and when they were intercepted by aircraft, the ammunition in use at the time had little effect. Despite this impunity, the material effect of the raids, with the exception of the L-13's success, was relatively slight. Navigation was very primitive, and as the war progressed, the British use of blackouts made it even harder. Bomb aiming was far from accurate. It is estimated that only 10% of the bombs dropped from Zeppelins actually hit their target. But the psychological impact of these raids was enough to cause the British to tie up 12 squadrons on home defence. Meanwhile at sea, the Germans declared their intent to starve Britain into submission by blockading her ports. But the Germans extended their blockade to include attacking ships flying neutral flags, including American vessels. What was particularly abhorrent was the attacks were carried out without warning, which was contrary to accepted rules of the sea. America was neutral, and there were many who wanted it to remain that way. But on May the 7th, a German U-boat sunk the Cunard liner Lusitania, killing over 1,100 civilians, including 128 Americans. The Lusitania had left New York on May the 1st. She was one of the fastest liners afloat, and even with one boiler shut down in order to preserve coal, she could still outrun a U-boat. As well as her passengers, she was carrying meat, medical supplies, copper, cheese, oil and machinery. But she was also secretly being loaded with munitions for Britain for the war. In order to try and deter passengers, the Germans placed an announcement in the newspaper next to Cunard's advertisement for her voyage. In it, they reminded readers that the Lusitania was regarded a legitimate target by the Germans. The warnings were dismissed as a propaganda ploy, and she set sail. Waiting for her off the coast of Ireland was U-20, whose captain already had earned a reputation for attacking without warning. A single torpedo struck Lusitania, to be followed by a mysterious second explosion. It was enough to send her to the bottom in around 20 minutes, before many of the lifeboats could be launched. When news of the attack reached the United States, there was outrage and widespread condemnation, resulting in a diplomatic crisis between Germany and the United States. Although the sinking of the Lusitania was not the reason that America eventually declared war on Germany in 1917, it certainly played a significant part in helping shape public opinion. In Britain, there was mounting criticism of the Royal Navy following the raid on the northeast by a squadron of German surface vessels. Public and political reaction in Britain expressed outrage that the German fleet could sail so close to the British coast and then proceed to shell coastal towns. Buoyed by the success of the raid, its commander, Admiral Franz von Hipper, planned another raid for the following month. He was, however, intercepted by the British on the 24th of January 1915 at Doggerbank, midway between Germany and Britain. The British had managed to intercept German wireless traffic thanks to a captured codebook. Consequently, Admiral David Beatty set sail with 5 battle cruisers to meet Hipper's 3. Realizing he was outnumbered, Hipper attempted to escape, believing the British battle cruisers to be relatively slow. But Beatty's cruisers were notably faster than their German counterparts, and they soon caught up with the raiders. But although a major British success appeared likely, Beatty, overcome by fears of mines and a false submarine sighting, decided to abandon the attack, allowing Hipper's squadron to escape. In March, Britain began blockading German ports. Although it would take time, it was to prove more successful than German attempts at similar action. Indeed, the British blockade played an important part in forcing the Germans to seek an armistice in 1918. By then, the country had all but run out of raw materials, and civilians were forced to forage through rubbish in search for food. In order to help combat the U-boat menace, a new type of armed merchantman was tried out. A gun was housed on the forward deck, which could be quickly prepared as soon as a U-boat surfaced to attack. Although the fighting along the Western Front had reached stalemate, the war in the East was going well for Germany. Following their success at Tannenberg the year before, there were some who questioned whether the Russians could recover, so great were their losses. At the end of January, the two sides clashed again at Bolimov, to the west of Warsaw in modern-day Poland. The battle was indecisive, although the Russians lost another 50,000 men. It was also the first time that the Germans used gas, although the freezing temperatures meant that the gas could not vaporize. Bolimov was the precursor to the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, which was intended to force Russia's defeat and so end the war on the Russian front. Also known as the Winter Battle because it opened during a severe blizzard, the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes was conceived by Paul von Hindenburg for a two-pronged decisive push against Russia by the Austrian and German armies. The plan was sanctioned by German Chief of Staff Erich Falkenhayn, albeit reluctantly, as he believed that victory in the west was within Germany's grasp. The battle began in a fierce snowstorm, but within a week, the Germans had advanced almost 70 miles against the Russian southern wing. As they fell back, the Russians were attacked from the north, this time against their right flank. In desperate fighting, the Russians fought off the German encirclement, allowing many to escape. They still suffered 56,000 casualties and many more taken prisoner. In order to try and bring relief to the hard-pressed Russians, the British devised a plan designed to knock Turkey out of the war and allow supplies through to Russia's Black Sea ports. The plan, the brainchild of British First Sea Lord to the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, was to mount an amphibious assault on the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. Initially it was conceived as an entirely naval affair in which the Turkish forts that lined the narrow straits would be bombarded into submission by a large force of ships. This was soon recognized as unrealistic, not least because naval artillery could not be expected to achieve the necessary steep trajectory required to knock out the forts. Also, even if the naval bombardment had been successful, the absence of ground troops would have prevented the British from gaining command of the shorelines. And in the absence of supplies from the shore, the naval fleet would have had to return home to refuel and restock. Nevertheless, Churchill's plan was formally approved by the War Cabinet at the end of January 1915. The British War Minister, Lord Kitchener, ordered that the only available division of infantry be placed in readiness should the naval endeavour prove successful. On the 19th of February, the attack began, but the combined British and French force proved ineffective in the face of an efficient Turkish defensive system and poor Allied gunnery. What the Allies did not realise was that they had inflicted great damage and the Turkish defenders were also critically short of ammunition. But rather than call off the endeavour in failure, the British and French governments decided to press forward with a combined naval and ground expedition, the whole to be led by Lord Kitchener's former protégé, the newly appointed Sir Ian Hamilton. Hamilton was assigned a force of 75,000 men and a further 18,000 French colonial troops. Facing him were 84,000 Turkish troops led by an attached German officer, Lehmann von Sanders. Initially he had just 20,000 men and limited ammunition. Coupled with organisational difficulties, he feared that an invasion attempt would succeed. But he need not have feared, for Hamilton had inherited an equally, if not more, disorganised operation. Quite aside from being unsure what he was expected to achieve, the courteous Hamilton had set sail from England minus his staff and with the absence of informed intelligence concerning the Turkish defences. In the event, the landings took place at two locations on the 25th of April 1915, Cape Helles and Arieburno, which was soon renamed Anzac Cove. These were selected by Hamilton on the basis that their capture would assist the progress of the Allied battle fleet along the straits. "35,000 men landed at Cape Helles on the peninsula's southern tip at 5 locations. Further along the Aegean coast, the 17,000 men of the Australian and New Zealand Corps, the Anzacs, were landed at Arieburno and Gabi Tepe. As the defenders still had to get themselves organized, a single division was all that was available to keep the Allies back. Despite their disadvantage, the Turks performed remarkably well in holding back the 35,000 troops of the invasion force at Cape Helles. Of the 5 landing sites, 2 came under heavy Turkish machine gun fire. The remaining 3 sites were quickly secured, but indecision in the chain of command meant that the advantage was not taken. The Anzacs fared rather better. Having found their entire landing unopposed, they took full advantage by pushing into the heights which overlooked the entire peninsula. However, a resolute Turkish defense force, hastily assembled by Colonel Kemal, halted the Anzac advance, eventually forcing them back to the beaches by the day's close. The Allied position by the end of the 25th of April was not therefore an encouraging one. Although landings had been achieved, any further advances had not been possible. Turkish troops quickly surrounded the Allied force and in addition were in possession of the heights above the beachheads. Hamilton's force, finding itself short of necessary ammunition, was further handicapped by the requirement to use its artillery sparingly. Yet the Turkish fort similarly found itself unable to advance, finding it difficult to push Hamilton's solidly entrenched men back into the sea. Stalemate set in, along with a particularly unpleasant form of trench warfare, similar to that experienced on the Western Front. Hamilton's overall losses were heavy. Up to 1/3 of his force had suffered casualties. He consequently requested reinforcements from Kitchener in London. The latter ultimately obliged, but not without first having to face a barrage of criticism from British and French commanders on the Western Front, adamant that reserves could not be spared. Eventually reinforced to 12 divisions, Hamilton's next move came on the 6th of August 1915, with a further landing at Suvla Bay. The aim was to link up with the Anzacs at Anzac Cove and to sweep across the peninsula. At the same time, the forces at Helles and Anzac Cove were to break out and link up with the new landing force. In planning both additional attacks, Hamilton was concerned to tie up as many Turkish troops as possible to guarantee the success of the fresh landings at Suvla Bay. Meanwhile, Turkish reinforcements continued to arrive on the peninsula, eventually building to 14 divisions. The landings were begun at 10 p.m. on the evening of the 6th of August. 20,000 troops landed at Suvla Bay with virtually no Turkish opposition, other than from sniper fire. The remainder of the British troops were successfully landed the following morning, albeit at disparate sites along the bay owing to reconnaissance failures. Delays in pressing forward allowed the Turks to bring up reinforcements, forcing the Allies back to their beachheads. Losses were predictably heavy. The Allies suffered approximately 18,000 casualties at Suvla Bay and at Anzac Cove, plus a further 3,500 at Helles. The Turks suffered 18,000 casualties at Anzac Cove and anything from 9 to 20,000 at Suvla Bay. Once again, a state of trench warfare set in from Suvla. Attempts to link up with the forces at Helles and Anzac Cove also ended in failure. Hamilton requested a further 95,000 reinforcements from British War Minister, but his request was turned down. With pressure mounting in France and a new attack at Salonika being planned, there were no reinforcements available. The only option was to evacuate, a decision supported by Kitchener himself following an inspection of the region. The British government, having prevaricated for several weeks, finally sanctioned an evacuation on the 7th of December. Unfortunately, by this stage, a heavy blizzard had set in, making such an operation hazardous. Nevertheless, the evacuation of 105,000 men and 300 guns from Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was successfully conducted from the 10th to the 20th of December 1915. The evacuation of 35,000 men from Helles was carried out from late December until 9th of January 1916. The evacuation operation was easily the most successful element of the entire campaign, with hardly any casualties. Painstaking efforts were made to deceive the 100,000 watching Turkish troops into believing that the movement of Allied troops did not constitute a withdrawal. 480,000 Allied troops have participated in the Gallipoli campaign. Of this figure, 252,000 were casualties, including 48,000 fatalities. Turkish casualties have been estimated at 250,000, of which at least 65,000 were believed to be fatalities. In the spring of 1915, attention turned back to the Western Front. At Neuf-Chapelle, to the west of Lille in northwest France, the Germans held a small salient. On the 10th of March, the British and French forces launched an attack to reduce the salient. Leading the attack was Douglas Haig's First Army. The assault began with an artillery barrage that lasted for 35 minutes. 342 guns pounded the Germans across a 2,000-yard line, supported by reconnaissance aircraft from the Royal Flying Corps. During the barrage, more shells were fired than at the whole of the Boer War, a sobering reflection on the transformation of warfare in the space of 15 years. Four divisions of 40,000 men were committed along a 3-kilometer front. The infantry found themselves often locked in hand-to-hand fighting, but initial progress was rapid. The British Expeditionary Force found itself quickly breaking through a section of the German line secured by only a single division of Crown Prince Ruprecht's 6th Army at Neuf-Chapelle village. It had taken just 4 hours to secure the village. Having achieved a real gain in the capture of the village, supply and communication problems began to plague Haig's troops. Ruprecht dispatched reserves to Neuf-Chapelle, launching a counterattack on the 12th of March. The British, nevertheless, managed to hold their gains, some 2 kilometers of ground originally lost in October 1914. But further progress towards the village of Hubert, which was the French objective, proved impossible. Of some 1,000 troops who attacked Hubert, none survived. The attack was consequently halted on the 13th of March. Allied casualties during the battle were 11,200. Losses among the German 6th Army were roughly similar, although 1,200 German troops were also captured by the British. Sir John French, the BEF's commander-in-chief, in part blamed a shortage of artillery shells for the lack of success beyond the initial advance. Shell production in Britain was unable to keep up with the demands of what was clearly going to be a long war. Following the intervention of Lord Northcliffe's Daily Mail, a new Ministry of Munitions was created under David Lloyd George. French decided that the BEF should stockpile greater quantities of shells in the future. But in extending the duration of such bombardments, the vital element of surprise vital to such attacks was lost, giving the Germans valuable additional time in which to prepare. Following the failure of the Allies' attack at Neuf-Chapelle, it was the turn of the Germans to attack, this time at Ypres in Belgium. It was to be the Germans' only major attack on the Western Front in 1915, as their efforts were concentrated on defeating the Russians. Indeed, the main aim of the offensive was to divert Allied attention away from the east. Second, Ypres, as the offensive is now known, is generally remembered as marking the first use of gas on the Western Front. Although introduced with minimum effect on the Russian Eastern Front at Bonomov by the Germans earlier in the year, its impact during Second Ypres was startlingly effective, even though its use was in conflict with the Hague Convention, which outlawed gas warfare. 5,700 canisters containing 168 tons of chlorine gas were released at sunset on the 22nd of April against French, Algerian and Territorial Division troops, following a brief preliminary bombardment by 17-inch howitzers. A veil of greenish-yellow mist could be seen rolling across from the German front lines to the French positions. The terrified Allied troops fled in panic towards Ypres, the heavy gas settling and clogging the trenches where it gathered. Covering 4 miles of trench lines, the gas affected some 10,000 troops, half of whom died within 10 minutes of the gas reaching the front line. Death was caused by asphyxiation. Those who lived were temporarily blinded and stumbled in confusion, coughing heavily. 2,000 of these troops were taken as prisoners of war. The two advancing German corps, wearing primitive respirators, paced warily through a clear 7-kilometer gap in the Allied lines. In planning the attack, no reserves had been thought necessary, the German command considering it inconceivable that a major breakthrough could be achieved. Indeed, German commanders were completely taken by surprise at the success of the attack. In consequence, the actual breakthrough was not exploited to the full. After advancing 3 kilometers into Allied lines, the Germans halted under a hail of a hastily prepared counteroffensive by the British Second Army. Even so, the loss of high ground to the north significantly weakened the Allied position. The Germans released a second batch of chlorine gas 2 days later, on the 24th of April, this time directed against Canadian troops situated northeast of Ypres, and again prefaced by a sharp artillery bombardment. Again, the German forces gained ground against the unprotected Canadian troops, although fighting was fierce, spreading far south to the area called Hill 60. But gas warfare was losing its impact, as it was relatively easy to protect troops from the effects of chlorine gas by issuing them with simple fence pads. As a result, the advancing German infantry sustained heavy losses in the fierce fighting that followed. General Smith-Dorrien proposed a 2.5-mile withdrawal close to Ypres. He felt that nothing short of a large-scale counter-offensive was likely to push the German forces back to their original positions. The idea was not well received by the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, who effectively dismissed Smith-Dorrien by sending him home to England. Ironically, Smith-Dorrien's replacement, General Herbert Plumer, also recommended a general withdrawal to French. This time, the suggestion was accepted. On the 24th of May, a heavy German assault forced a further Allied withdrawal. But the Germans were also running out of supplies and manpower, and so they were obliged to call off the offensive. Instead, they resorted to pummeling the ancient town with artillery, intent on reducing it to rubble. Even so, the German attack had considerably reduced the size of the Allied salient. The highest ground had been lost, and it was no more than 3 miles across and 5 miles deep. Losses during the Second Battle of Ypres were estimated at 69,000 Allied troops against 35,000 German troops. This time the difference in numbers was explained by the use of chlorine gas. But its use in Belgium only put further strain on Germany's already fragile relations with the still neutral United States. From now on, gas was used by both sides with mixed success. The British first used gas during the Battle of Loos, begun in early May, while fighting was still going on to the north of Ypres. It formed part of a wider offensive in the Artois region by British and French forces. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre and British commanders relied upon numerical supremacy, sometimes as much as 3-1 in favour of the French, to overpower the Germans. But attacks at Vimy Ridge near Arras had not been successful. The Loos offensive began on the 25th of September, following a 4-day artillery bombardment in which 250,000 shells were fired. But it was deemed a failure as the German defences were found intact, and so was called off on the 28th of September. Despite serious misgivings, Douglas Haig, the British commander, committed 6 divisions to the attack. He was much concerned at both a marked shortage in available shells and at the fatigued state of his troops, who were suffering from fatigue. He was also concerned at the nature of the difficult terrain that would need to be crossed. Set against these concerns, however, was the reality that the British enjoyed massive numerical supremacy against their German opposition at Loos, in places of 7-1. Once the preliminary artillery bombardment had concluded, Haig's battle plans called for the release of 5,100 cylinders of chlorine gas, the equivalent of 140 tons. The quantity of gas used was designed to entirely overcome the primitive state of German gas mask design in use at the time. Unfortunately, the release of gas was not a great success. In places, the wind blew the gas back into the British trenches, resulting in 2,632 British gas casualties, although only 7 actually died. After several days of sporadic fighting, the British were eventually forced to order a retreat. It was during this battle that Rudyard Kipling's son John was lost, believed killed. The fact that he was listed as missing sparked a crusade by his parents to locate his body and give it a proper burial, but without success. Their grief only served to highlight a burden that was being endured by thousands of parents throughout the country. The Loos attack was renewed by the British on the 13th of October, when further heavy losses, combined with poor weather, caused the offensive to be called off. During the battle, the British suffered 50,000 casualties. German casualties were estimated much lower, at approximately half the British total. The British failure at Loos contributed to the replacement of Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief by Douglas Haig at the end of 1915. Elsewhere, French progress along the Champagne part of the front was limited despite early successes. As the Allies were beginning to learn, the Germans were too well dug in. All too often, artillery barrages were failing to cut the fields of barbed wire that lay in front of the German trenches. Also, German machine guns were usually well positioned in what amounted to small fortresses, reinforced with concrete. Even if the assault troops managed to find their way through the wire, they often found that the artillery had had little effect on the deeply dug German bunkers. The Germans were also marshalling their reserves well. They were keeping only a minimum number of men necessary to hold a sector, while holding a much larger number of men back in their second-line defences, out of range of the artillery. Once the barrage came to an end, these forces were sent forward to launch a counterattack. The attack was usually successful, as the numbers of attacking troops had been whittled down by the machine guns. The losses and conditions in Flanders and western France were appalling. But along the Italian front they reached new depths. The The Italians had come into the war in May 1915 on the side of the Allies. Most of the fighting was to be concentrated along the Isonzo River, which is located in present-day Slovenia. During the First World War, however, the 60-mile-long river ran north to south just inside Austria, along its border with Italy at the head of the Adriatic Sea. It was difficult terrain, as it was flanked by mountains on either side. The 400-mile front was mountainous and dominated by the Austrians, who had anticipated that Italy would eventually come into the war. Chief of Staff Luigi Cardogna judged that their best chance of success lay in attacking across the coastal plain east of the lower end of the Isonzo. However, he also believed that the Italian army could strike further north and bypass the mountains either side of the river, so as to come at the Austro-Hungarians in the rear. But he expected operations in the Isonzo sector to be far from easy. He was also well aware that the river was prone to flooding, made worse by record rainfalls during 1914-18. There would be some 12 battles along the Isonzo, all of which either ended in stalemate or disaster. In 1915, there were 4 battles along the Isonzo. Although the Italians had numerical superiority, the Austro-Hungarian forces occupied most of the mountains overlooking the river. Thus they were content to defend and let the Italians try and dislodge them. Cardogna had every intention of attacking at this point and had steadily built up his forces accordingly before Italy's declaration of war. But the Austro-Hungarians also knew what he was going to do, and so they also had time to prepare. The first battle of the Isonzo began on the 23rd of June. But the Italians were making the same mistake as commanders on the Western Front, sending infantry to assault well-prepared defences without sufficient artillery support. After 2 weeks of fighting in which the Italians only achieved small gains, the attack was called off. But the respite was to be brief, as the second battle at the Isonzo was launched on the 18th of July. Thus the pattern was set. During the battle that followed, the Italians never did succeed in crossing the river and holding the far bank, let alone making any serious territorial gains. Cumulative casualties of the numerous battles of the Isonzo were enormous. Half of the entire Italian war casualty total of 600,000 was suffered along the Isonzo. Austro-Hungarian losses, while by no means as numerous, were nevertheless high, at around 200,000 out of an overall total of around 1.2 million casualties. 1915 ended with the Allies making their withdrawal from Gallipoli. In many ways, that event typified their fortunes throughout 1915. Small gains at enormous cost in men's lives, only to be forced back to their starred lines. But there was to be no respite. In 1916, the suffering was set to continue, achieving new depths in the scale of slaughter.